Hello, I'm Cosette Lemlin. I'm an educational developer with the Center for Teaching and Learning. This is a brief recording from a presentation that I gave in early December 2016 for our colleagues who were not able to attend. Welcome to the workshop, How Can I Make Multiple Choice Questions More Effective? The first thing I'm going to show you is a multiple choice question and clarify some of the vocabulary around a multiple choice question, only to make sure that we're speaking the same language and using the same terms about multiple choice questions. So let's take a look at the question that I have at the top part of this slide. Multiple choice questions in my course assess my students' abilities to memorize, reason or problem solve, take a test, or read. In this multiple choice question, I'd like you to take a moment to identify the STEM, the alternatives, also known as the responses or options, the distractors, which are also known as foils in some parts of the world, and I'd also like you to decide what your response is. So please take a moment to do that. In this multiple choice question, the STEM is the statement at the top, which is usually phrased as a statement or a question, sometimes as a fill in the gap. Multiple choice questions in my course assess my students' abilities to is the STEM. The alternatives are the A, B, C, and D in the question. Distractors are the incorrect answers because, well, they want to distract the students from the correct response. Your response to this question, well, many of the faculty members in my workshop tell me that they would really like to test their students' abilities to reason or problem solve. Very few faculty members intentionally want students to answer questions that require them to test their ability to take a test or test their reading ability. The reality is, however, many of the multiple choice questions that we create test students' ability to read. Those are read and memorize. Those are the things that are most tested on multiple choice questions. So I'm going to give you some strategies today to get at the knowledge and thinking skills, possibly the soft skills that you would like to test your students' abilities on more effectively. So let's start out by looking at what we're going to do today. In today's workshop, you will be introduced to the notion of a test blueprint and a test bank. These concepts are not the focus of this presentation. There will be follow-up presentations from CTL on these topics, but I do want you to be aware of these two concepts at this point when you're making decisions about creating your multiple choice questions. I'm going to test your knowledge on best practice in item writing using some multiple choice questions that I've created. And I'm going to share some questions that I typically have about the types of multiple choice questions because it's no secret that faculty members tend to use the same format or types of questions over and over again, and there are further options, and share some of the most commonly asked questions that I have at the Center for Teaching and Learning about creating multiple choice questions. So let's start out with the concept of what is a test blueprint and what is a test bank and why these strategies might be useful. To get at the answers to these questions, I need to make a really important point. If you only take 1 point away from this workshop, it should be that you focus your multiple choice questions on what's really important in your course. So what are the most important, those core concepts that you want to test on your multiple choice exam? Essentially, your students will study what they think is on the test. Students will learn what they're graded on. So if you think reasoning and problem solving are most important, but you test them on your memorization, memorizing is what your students are going to learn. It has been established that there are 3 different types of multiple choice question assessments. 3 things you can assess using multiple choice questions. You can assess students' memorized knowledge. So, for example, your multiple choice question asks students to recognize, identify, describe. You can test students' thinking skills. by asking them to apply some knowledge they've studied, analyze something, evaluate, make a judgment on something, or solve, for example, a problem. And although it's used less frequently, multiple choice questions can be used to assess students' soft skills. So, for example, their ethical skills or their interpersonal or communication skills. So the first question I have for you today is, what balance of memorized knowledge, thinking skills, and soft skills do you want on your test? Well, let's take a look at what are some examples of each of these types of knowledge or skills, just to be clear. Which multiple choice question requires the students to memorize, think, or use soft skills? I'm going to show you a few multiple choice questions, and I'd like you to determine what types of thinking or skills the students are using. So take a look at this question. Am I asking the student to memorize, think, or use soft skills? This question asks your students about soft skills. Basically, how the, in this case, the nurse, interacts with the patient, given the patient's communication. How about this question? In this question, the students are asked to apply knowledge about low sodium and high sodium foods to determine which lunch complies with the diet. And this is, it's no surprise, a memorization question. The student simply has to remember how many teeth they have. So why is this important? Well, once you've determined how many memorize versus thinking skills versus soft skill questions that you want to have on your multiple choice test, you can create a blueprint. This is an example blueprint. I'll give you a second to take a look at this. In this test blueprint for Introduction to Statistics, Linda Suskie has created a template for what is going to be on her exam. Now, she's determined the number of points that will be assigned to certain types of questions. So in order to do this, she had to think carefully about the types of questions she was going to create, make this template, and then this blueprint can be shared with the students for when they ask that question, what is going to be on the test. So basically, the test blueprint defines the parameters of the assessment. So when you create the exam, you know what kinds of questions that you are creating. And the students can use it as a study guide. You write the test based on the blueprint, and you create a very valid or fair test for the students. Now, whether you are using questions you've created or borrowed from a colleague or from a publisher, you can align those existing questions with the expectations for the course. Another way that you can think carefully about the types of multiple choice questions that you're creating and using on your test to get at what you would like students to learn is to use a test bank. You may have already come in contact with a test bank as a ready-made online resource of questions from textbook publishers. Well, these questions can be organized into categories not only based on the content knowledge, but also based on whether they ask students to memorize, to think, or to use soft skills. This can be done effectively through eClass or Moodle, and there'll be a workshop in January led by CTL's Associate Director Ken Kaur about the technical aspects of how you can organize questions in a test bank. So stay tuned if you're interested in participating in this workshop. The focus of my presentation today, though, is on best practice in multiple choice item writing. So essentially, how can you construct a question that is fair, that is valid, and going back to that initial point, how can you construct a question that is not about students' reading ability, their test-taking ability, but about what you really want them to learn in the course, without creating questions that students can answer if they haven't studied the material. Let's look at a first example. You'll notice that my questions are holiday questions, because I wanted to make this a bit fun. You need to purchase a gift for your spouse who has taken an interest in cooking. The following stores will have cookbooks or cooking supplies except. Many multiple choice questions, whether they're from a test bank or they're created by a faculty member, will include negative words like except or avoid or not. I'm going to discourage you from using these negative words in the STEM because the students quite often will go quickly from the STEM to the alternatives and choose the incorrect answer unless they're very carefully paying attention. So it creates a bit of a question that's not fair play, in my professional opinion. I would encourage you to switch the question around and make it into something positive. So in this instance, you need to purchase a gift for your spouse who has taken an interest in cooking. The following store will have cookbooks or cooking supplies: the Gap, the Gourmet Village, the Liquor Market, and the Source. So in this case, we don't have a negative word. If you insist on using a negative word, I strongly encourage you to make it in bold, put it in caps, or underline it so that students can't miss it. And if they studied the information, they will still likely get the right answer. Here's another example where students can get tripped up, and it's more of a test of their reading ability and their test-taking ability than their understanding of the information. In this case, a thinking question. You are meeting your brother's new romantic partner for the first time over holiday dinner with your immediate and extended family. Which comment is not necessarily inappropriate? In a test-taking situation, students tend to be highly anxious, and questions like this, not necessarily inappropriate, are really going to get them even more anxious because they're not quite sure what you're asking here. I would be, in this case, if you are going to ask them to solve a question like this, I would recommend that you make it more clear, like you are meeting your brother's new romantic partner for the first time over holiday dinner with your immediate and extended family. Which comment is appropriate or which is most appropriate? Soft skill questions often use this, which is appropriate, which is most appropriate. Here's a memorization type question, and I would say that the key thing about this question is how many options do we really need to test the student's knowledge? Which of the locations below are closed on December 25th? Well, the research tells us that we really only need 3 to 5 options to make an effective multiple choice question. Many of the faculty members that I work with will say 3 options means not enough choice. That's only 33% chance the students can get it correct. So I would say 4 to 5 is probably what you want to go for. I mean, if it's 6, it's not the end of the world, but certainly options like this are unnecessarily tricky for students. There is some literature that also argues that all of the above and none of the above are really not fair play for students, or all of these multiple combinations. Essentially, what I'm recommending is that you remove the barriers in multiple choice questions for students who know the material. So try to avoid using terms like avoid, accept, never, violate, double negatives, vague frequency or amount items in the STEM, because they do more than really test the student's ability to understand or think about the information. Really what they do is test their reading ability and their test taking. So what about questions that have clues in them, not because we want them there, but how do we create questions where there aren't any clues for students who haven't studied the material and are looking at the question to try and figure out what the right answer is based on how the question is written? Let's look at some of those examples. A social worker would help the elf on the shelf meet his self-esteem needs by... Now, in this case, a student would look at the question, they haven't studied the information, and what a student would likely see is in A, the children help the elf, in B, the social worker helps the elf, in C, the elf takes care of himself, and in D, the social worker helps the elf with his Christmas duties. So really the only correct answer would be C, because the elf is taking care of himself. So that would improve his self-esteem needs. So there's the there's the clue of self and how does the elf help himself. And then in question A, B, and D, the items are fairly similar with someone else helping the elf. So a student might decipher this question that way and actually get the right answer without having studied. That's not what we want, right? Here's another example. When monitoring your bank accounts over the holiday season, look for statements you do not recognize, purchases that you do not make, delayed payments, or overdrafts. So A and B mean very much the same thing. And so students would quickly cross out these two options because it can't be two things that mean exactly the same thing, particularly if there aren't A and B as an option. How much does the average Canadian spend on holiday gifts during the holiday season? In this case, the correct answer is $766, and you might have caught that because it's such a precise number. But what tends to happen when faculty members create multiple choice questions is that we put in the right answer, and then we choose a value above or below that answer. So there's a couple points here. The first is that C and B are most commonly chosen as the correct answer, and then we put in a value above or below this. So the first thing you need to consider is sometimes you need to make the correct answer A and then have many values above that or below that, whether your answers are lowest to highest or highest to lowest. The other clue here is that C is much more precise, and you need to change the other options so that they are also quite precise. So the best ways to remove clues in multiple choice questions for students who do not know the material is to avoid putting in two alternatives or options that mean the same thing. Avoid putting in a correct alternative that is much longer than the other alternatives. All your alternatives should be plausible. So, for example, in the case of a problem that the students have to solve, try doing the problem yourself. And if there's a few places that the students could go wrong with the problem, put in those other plausible answers to your question. A middle value is most often the correct answer. Students will notice and make best guesses based on a middle value, which is why we've often heard the term, when in doubt, choose C among our students. So sometimes make the correct answer A or D. And the correct alternative, students that have no idea what the answer is, they are often going to guess as a pair of direct opposites. So try to avoid sometimes making the correct alternative a pair of direct opposites. It may not be avoidable all the time, but it's just a clue to help you reduce the best guesses. So what are the formats for multiple choice exams? Well, I have given you lots of examples of conventional or traditional multiple choice questions. True and false, are also known as alternative choice, are becoming less and less used only because it's a 50-50 chance of students getting it right. Fill in the blank. I find that faculty members have less questions beyond what I've talked about today in terms of 1 and 3, where I find I am now answering the most questions as an educational developer are in terms of the matching options or the interpretive or context-dependent item sets. I am going to include some examples of matching and interpretive context-dependent item sets with this presentation that you can take a look at. I think it might be best if you take a look at these examples and then email me with any questions that you might have. But just for the sake of clarity here, matching should include lots of different options for the match. So you'll see in the example that I've provided you, there are often more options than there are stems for the matching. And in an interpretive or context-dependent item set, what you're looking at is some sort of problem or description of a case with multiple questions underneath, often multiple choice questions underneath that description or problem. I've also seen more commonly true or false questions that are asked about that question or problem. So please do take a look at the two examples that I've provided with this presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions over email. A few of the most commonly asked questions about multiple choice exams or questions here at CTL is number 1, how do I organize my alternatives? What should be longer, the stem or the alternatives? So the stem should be longer than the alternatives. The stem is where the bulk of the information should be found. I also encourage you to organize your alternatives chronologically, alphabetically. It doesn't matter if it's from lowest to highest or highest to lowest, but they should be organized logically. So in this case, Who Invented Christmas Lights is alphabetical. And something else I'd like you to notice in the second question is that the alternatives are organized grammatically in a way that is very similar. This is called parallelism if you're familiar with it, but grammatically they say a pair of, a package of, a pair of, a couple of. This makes it less of a reading test and less easy for those who are looking for clues because they don't know the answer to find the right answer. And a couple other questions that I'm commonly asked is how many questions should I have on my test? Students complain quite loudly and frequently when they think they've had an unfair number of questions on your test. So here's the literature on this. Memorization type multiple choice questions should take about 30 to 45 seconds or less, depending on the length of the question. Beyond that, students are starting to look for clues. Thinking multiple choice questions tend to take 60 to 90 seconds, and soft skill questions about 60 seconds or less. So keep those numbers in mind when you are thinking about how many questions you want to have in a particular length of multiple choice exam or test. How much should each multiple choice question be worth? Well, it is possible in eClass or Moodle to assign a different value to different multiple choice questions. And if you have questions about that, we're happy to answer by email. But for example, if you want to have 1 point for your memorization type multiple choice questions, you can do that. If you want to have 2 or 3 points for your thinking or soft skill questions, we can do that. But how much should each question be worth? Well, I recommend that you keep it fairly low stakes and have each question worth 1 to 3 points. I think when you're getting up to 5 points or more, the stakes for any particular question are quite high, and I would recommend making it pretty low stakes. So if they miss one question, then it doesn't have as much of an impact on their grade. These questions are most commonly asked and certainly do not represent all of the questions that can be asked about multiple choice questions or tests. Again, my name is Cosette, and if you have further questions about multiple choice question item writing, I'm here and happy to help. Please contact us at the Center for Teaching and Learning if we can be of further assistance.